Welcome and thank you for joining the second ReThink Health Toolbox webinar series. My name is Maggie Cook and I'm a Strategic Partnerships Manager with the Ripple Foundation. As we enter into this shared virtual space alongside one another, we hope you can take a moment to get settled in and grounded. Allow me to set the table we are gathered around today. The intent of the ReThink Health Toolbox webinar series is to help stewards drive transformative change by learning about ReThink Health's tools and resources. This series is one of many ways for us to build the movement towards thriving together, recognizing, of course, that none of us can do this alone. We have shared language around how this can be achieved, and it's through shared stewardship. This series is meant to help us all embrace our role in transforming the future of equitable health and well-being. It's also a way for us to share an introduction to ReThink Health's tools, practices, and frameworks proven to drive deep, meaningful, and long-term change. We kicked off this series with an overview of the vital conditions for health and well-being. Today, we'll be providing an introduction to shared stewardship. Together, we'll explore the practice of shared stewardship and spend time sharing stories of impact. A few practical notes on norms. We encourage you all to share your questions and reflections in the chat as we go. We will address them as best we can live, and we'll reserve the last 30 minutes of this 90-minute webinar for Q&A. If you'd like to access closed captions or live transcription, we've enabled those functions which you can initiate in the bottom ribbon of your screen. You'll see the CC icon for closed caption with a little caret next to it where you can adjust your settings. If you have any questions about that, please feel to message me in chat. We also encourage you to turn your cameras on if possible, take a look around the room and notice friends or even connections yet to be made. Lastly, please note that a link to the recording of today's presentation, including the slides and supporting materials, will be made available afterwards. Looking ahead, our next webinar will be hosted on November 9th, during which we'll explore cultivating belonging and civic muscle. I see a lot of familiar friends here today and so many new faces, and we're honored to have you all here. Learning with and from place is an honor. This virtual webinar is hosted from Morristown, New Jersey, the physical location of the Ripple Foundation. We offer our deep gratitude and respect to the Munsee Lenape people, the earliest stewards of this place, including their elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. Once again, today's webinar is an introduction to shared stewardship. Our speakers are Bobby Milstein, Director of System Strategy, and Verinda Sood, Program Coordinator. I'll first turn it over to Verinda to kick us off. Verinda?
Thank you, Maggie, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for your contributions to today's check-in question. We'll be circling back to them shortly, so please keep them coming. To begin, I'd like to give some additional background on shared stewardship. ReThink Health has been studying for a decade who has been doing the work of equitable system change and how they go about it through research and close accompaniment with colleagues. In trying to understand these big questions, we found that at the center of these questions are stewards practicing shared stewardship. So for today's purpose, we're going to introduce you to this concept of shared stewardship and provide some language to the work that you may already be doing or see throughout your community, and overall learn from one another as we become better stewards of an equitable, thriving future. Before we dive any further, I want to take a moment to center shared stewardship on people. People working together and taking care of one another and their communities are at the heart of shared stewardship. And I love seeing all your answers to the check-in question as they remind us how connected we are to the places and people we love. And I know for me, reflecting on that question, I thought about my place in North Jersey and how I live with some of my closest friends and a short drive away from my cousins and grandparents. So reflecting on this is an important piece of our stewardship journey. As you get a sense of what stewardship is, we want to understand of your ideas of what stewardship, of your ideas of stewardship before today's webinar. So please take 30 seconds to complete this brief poll. How familiar are you with the term stewardship? And in what context have you heard stewardship before? Okay, hopefully everyone can see the results, but we'll go through them right now. So for the first question, how familiar are you with the term stewardship? We have a mixed group in the room, which is great. We hope that we invite everyone to add their questions, stories, insights, anything that resonates with you in the chat throughout this presentation, no matter where you are in this journey. And going on to the next question, in what context have you heard the term stewardship before? Top three are environment, economic, and theology. For me personally, before joining Ripple, I heard of stewardship in the environment context. But no matter where have you heard of this term before, we see that stewardship has long-standing tradition in many contexts. But for today, we're going to anchor stewardship in what can stewards create? Next slide, please. So who are stewards and what can they create? We can use this simple definition that stewards are people, organizations, and networks who work with others to create the conditions that everyone needs to thrive together, beginning with those who are struggling and suffering. And everyone can be a steward. As we begin to process this definition, let's understand what thriving is and how do we get there. If you joined us in our last webinar, these next few slides may seem familiar. We really want to emphasize how stewards affect our ability to thrive. They are oriented around this shared vision of all people and places thriving, no exception. But what is thriving? Thriving is all of us living our best possible life. And any of us falling short of that means we are struggling and suffering. So stewards create the conditions where all of us are living our best possible life. But how do we get there? How are we doing right now? And how have we been doing? The answer is not so well. If we take a look at this graph, we see right off the bat, about 50% of US adults are thriving. The other half are struggling and suffering with no real improvement throughout these years. If we dig a little deeper and break it up by race and ethnicity, we see meaningful differences among these subgroups. But also, once again, we are seeing that these numbers are hovering around 50% across all populations. So how do we move in a direction where we move these trend lines upwards in a way that everyone is thriving? How might we reach even greater heights of well-being, equity, and resilience? This is going to take more than a program or project. It's going to take a movement. And this movement is essential and inclusive of all of us. And this is made possible by stewards working interdependently with a shared vision, shared aspiration of thriving. And this is not unlike what we see here, these individuals, stewards in a boat, who have to work interdependently, have to communicate, collaborate, to move forward and reach their shared destination. And we see stewards join this movement every day. And because we are better together in times of adversity, stewards across these communities, across the country, are rising. And we've had the privilege to work, meet, and learn from many of the stewards you see here on the screen. And we're going to hear from two amazing stewards from Delaware today and what draws them to this work. I'll turn it over to Maggie to introduce them.
Thanks, Brenda. I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Ms. Dora and Ms. Smithers, who will share a bit about what stewardship means to them. You can also check out more about Ms. Dora's story featured in a Fulcrum article just published yesterday and co-authored by ReThink Health's very own Jane Erickson and Bobby Milstein. We'll drop the link to that article in the chat. Here's a little bit of background on our guests. Dora Williams is a community advocate and the Director of Outreach for Newcastle Prevention Coalition, NCPC. Her expertise is often sought after by other organizations and agencies because she developed and implemented the most effective outreach program in the Route 9 corridor just south of Wilmington, Delaware. Dora is known for her neighborhood canvassing, her skillful organizing, and the way she engages residents to help them resolve their own problems. Sandra Smithers is the Executive Director of Newcastle Prevention Coalition, NCPC. She is a retired district science specialist and science teacher. After retirement, Sandra became the Executive Director of NCPC, and with the assistance of Dora Williams and supportive community partners, together they were able to take NCPC from a fledgling grassroots organization to the viable community service organization that it is today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Smithers and Miss Dora. Let's see if I can find them here.
Here we are.
Here. Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's kind of difficult to know where to begin with this journey that we've been on. But this has been a 10-year journey, and I was kind of brought into much of it by my relationship with Dora Williams. Dora is tenacious about community organizing and advocating for people. And I have a passion for young people especially, but people who are striving against odds that are not necessarily of their own making. And so we live in a very interesting kind of community because it is a community that developed, it branched out from one that was established for African-American World War II veterans in the midst of all white neighborhoods. And this was before desegregation. So as we encountered white flight, as our communities moved out, the Route 9 corridor became a predominantly African-American and neighborhoods of color. It's very interesting because that caused us to be, even though we're very discrete neighborhoods, we're all kind of interconnected. And so it gives us the platform to work with people who have common needs and also to bring others into the fold who become a part of this whole network. And so that's been a very interesting journey. It's a very difficult one to implement because we're also an environmental justice community. So we experience all of the problems that come with being an environmental justice community, but we do have the one good thing that I can say, and that's the strength and unity that we have. We interconnect, we talk with people, and that's generally what I rely on Dora to do. Recently, we've been able to expand from, it was initially Dora and me, but now it's Dora, and she has a staff of community health workers that she works with. She trains and she gives guidance to and counsel to oftentimes when they encounter problems. So I'm going to turn this over to Dora, and she can talk about how she does her community organizing and how it affects the community. How do you like that?
I always speak about Mrs. Smithers because she tells all of my business. She tells everything that I do. So, but in this case, I gotta say she did a good job. She really did. She done good. She did good. So I want to talk about a little bit about our journey and how our journey ties into stewardship. Because when we think about stewardship, we think about stewardship, we think about how we are to take care of our creation, the creation that we were made to take care of and that was supposed to service us until. So that's what really got us here. And part of that stewardship, I got ahead of myself. I want to say that I think one of the best things in the world that happened was when environmental justice expanded their definition for environmental justice, which is it's where kids play, people raise their families, work, worship, and leave a legacy. So we educate in these environments, and we give people jobs in these environments, and we take care of one another there. We visit with one another, and we talk about aging in place and leaving a legacy for our children. And so it's when you come up the street and you see the kid that graduated, and you know that maybe one parent has passed away and they've taken over the house, and they remember you from when they were a kid. And it's the same camaraderie. That's where I think stewardship has taken over, because it starts to include not only one generation, but lots of generations. And then it begins to move outside into what we call the communities at large, because at community center, people come and they learn about who's here, and they come back because the atmosphere has actually spoken to them and tells them to come back and see the people that reside here. And whatever if they need something that is here, they come back to get that. And they send people here. Whenever they talk to someone that has a difficulty about anything, they send them here as well. So it is indeed a journey, because on this journey, we see that we begin to, I call it infectious. It's like an infectious love. It's like COVID, but it takes care of you. It doesn't hurt you. And when it becomes that infectious, it does. It's like the commercial. They used to have the commercial years ago called A Coke and a Smile. And these people would come on the TV, and you would see people all over the United States. They would be holding hands in a circle, and Coca-Cola would be in the center. It was like, have a Coke and a smile. So that's the way I look at stewardship. And I belong to an organization called Delaware Concern for Environmental Justice, who was born out of stewardship. There was two Episcopal churches in Wilmington. Actually, one was a Methodist church and the other one was an Episcopal church. So what happened was the two churches, actually, the memberships went down because people were passing away, the older people. And so these two churches wanted to be able to still thrive. So they merged these two churches. One was a Black church and the other one was a Caucasian church. And they joined forces. They merged. They became one church. They're called St. Matthew's. It's called Sam's because it's St. Matthew's and St. Andrew's. And so when they merged, they have what they call a season of creation. And during the season of creation, they decided to do something in commemoration of their commitment of stewardship of creation. And so Delaware Concern for Environmental Justice was born out of that. That was in 2010. And I think I've been with them since around 2016 or 2017. And so when I think about creation, when I think about environment, I think about creation because my granddaughter says to me the other day, we were on our way to the library, I think it was, and we were talking, and she said, we were talking about high blood pressure and different things. And she says, well, how does that happen? And I said, well, It happens in your arteries, you know, in your body. She said, well, they don't teach me that at school. I said, they don't? She said, no, they teach me about butterflies. So we have expanded our stewardship from teaching about butterflies to teaching about arteries. And that's the ticket. I think that's the ticket. And I started knocking on doors because, you know, oftentimes people say, well, I think the community needs this, and I think the community needs that. And I said, well, did anybody ask them? They said, what do you mean, did anybody ask them? Well, did you talk to them? I said, well, yeah, did you knock on the door and ask them what they need? No, we didn't do that. I said, well, maybe we should. I think if you want to know what somebody thinks, you got to ask them. You can't just think what they think, because we're not mind readers, right? We can say, well, I think they need this, but well, I don't know, you better ask first. So that was my way of saying, what do you think? And we actually have a survey called What Do You Think? And so we knock on the door, and we started a little newsletter, and we have a distribution. We deliver it to 2,000 homes along the Route 9 area. And when we knock on the door, we say, hey, did you get your Route 9 newsletter? Well, everybody knows now, but in the beginning, and they would say no or yes. And I would say, and I always have a bunch with me, right? So they would say no. I said, I just happen to have one for you, and give it to them and tell them everything that's in it. And I just want to say how infectious this thing is, because this stewardship thing, because we were actually canvassing one day, and we saw this gentleman, and he was actually out in the front yard, and we thought, oh, this has got to be his house. So we said, oh, do you live here? He said, no. He said, my friend lives here, but he's in the hospital. We said, oh, sorry. We brought him this newsletter, and you know, it was just some things, and then maybe he can read it and, you know, be what's happening in the community and what have you. And, you know, there's help in there for people who need home rehabs and what have you. So the guy said, okay, I'll take it to him. Wow. As the story unfolds, he does go in the hospital, and he becomes an amputee. His mother has to move out of her house to North Carolina because she doesn't have anyone there to help take care of her. She gets to North Carolina. Well, he takes this newsletter, and the house needs it needs an HVAC system, and it also needs some things in it because they want to go back into the home, so they will need to have the bathroom to be handicap accessible and everything. So he takes it to him, and he gives it to him. In the meantime, he gives it to his sister in North Carolina, where the mother is. The sister calls NCPC, and I didn't realize it until I was talking with the sister, his sister, and I said, "You calling from North Carolina?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, where did you get our newsletter from?" So then she told the story about her brother who was in the hospital, and the friend he actually did take him the newsletter in the hospital. So it's
the end of the story was that we were able to help them. We were able to actually help them. I don't know if Dora was going to tell you that part.
She stole my thunder, didn't she? So, but yeah, so that's the end of the story. But that's my story about stewardship. It encompasses everything and everybody.
Wow. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here, for sharing that story. I had a chance to meet you guys before. And that word, infectious love, I mean, it's an indelible thing when you meet a steward, when you're in their presence and they have stories to tell about the things that move them to do work, to connect with others, to connect with place. It's not the kind of thing that one forgets too soon. And I think the 50 or 60 of us on this call right now, 66 of us are not going to forget this moment of being with you and the people that you're telling about how you're sharing your lives with them. This is one of the things that we see over and over and over again about the reason that even just a few people can have such significant effects on the world is because it always begins with individuals, but we are individuals located within organizations, and those organizations can look across their walls and connect with others. And when stewardship becomes the guiding force of how we are, not just like on our day job for a few hours every now and then, but how we are every day in every way at every level, that can unlock immense capabilities. And you know, I heard this even in the stories that you just shared right now, right? The kind of personal passion, the personal faith that brings you to want to connect with other people and to understand the history of place. But then what that means to create an organization 9 years ago, to start an organization devoted to this kind of work, that's willing to knock on doors and ask the question about what do you think, and not just guess. And then merging across color, across traditions, and be able to actually have a more unified way of engaging in the world, not erasing our differences, but using those differences as an asset to reach more and more people and project more and more of the values that we hold in common. That's how stewardship can work across scales, and it's kind of a hallmark of this practice. One of the things that makes stewardship so immensely, sort of fascinating, and we heard it right now in these stories, is we are change makers working in different arenas, different organizations, sometimes with very different purposes and resources. How do we keep all of that together when we're working in so many different ways? A typical sort of program and project view of the world would have a hard time making sense of what's going on across so many sort of arenas of practice. But a lot of what stewardship teaches us is the focus on establishing those conditions that we all need to thrive together, that nobody could do without, and yet many of us have been denied, or many of these circumstances have been displaced. And these are there's thousands of conditions in the world that we all need to thrive, but a small subset, relatively small subset, are vital conditions that nobody could ever do without, and yet many of us do not enjoy yet. And at the center of those is we ourselves, right? Everybody feeling like we belong, everybody feeling that we have things to bring, and that together, through our wide sense of belonging and civic muscle, there's really hardly any challenge that we couldn't accomplish, right? We can express our values in all kinds of areas of life around the thriving natural world. We're talking about environmental justice, but that gets right into basic needs for clean air and clean water and nutritious food and freedom from addiction and trauma and violence, even routine healthcare. But it gets into humane housing and meaningful work and wealth, lifelong learning, reliable transportation. This list is really at the heart of getting very clear, very practical about the kinds of things that we could do together through concerted, action to create a world that doesn't yet exist, but one that's built for everyone to thrive together. And I'm happy to say, since our team at ReThink Health had a hand in helping articulate these vital conditions, and we work with thousands of colleagues across the years, there are more and more organizations at every level in every corner of the US that is beginning to recognize that organizing around these vital conditions makes our shared work a lot more clear, and a lot more capable of being able to know, where do we go next for those that are continuing to struggle and suffer? It's not by accident. It's because they don't have the vital conditions in place that they most need to thrive. So, maybe we'll take a step back and just contrast this approach to making equitable system change. Verinda said at the top of the call that we've been studying who does that work and how do they go about it. And there's two kind of general mindsets that we often see. Some people, like a lot of people in the country, they do want to, sort of unlock potential for health and well-being. They want to see equitable system change, but they spend 99% of their time thinking of specific interventions, programs and projects that are sort of bounded to deliver certain outcomes. And they're hoping those are going to, sort of make the difference in long-term health and well-being and equity. And the truth is, some of those programs and projects are incredibly influential. But they tend to be weak or temporary. The effects are not always lasting and sort of strong enough to see over time when we're really just working on discrete programs and projects. And that's the best of them. Many of them are not nearly as strong as we hope they are. And so there's got to be a better way than this transactional program and project approach. The other way, we've already begun to hear it on this call, is to not even talk about goals, talk about expectations. How do we want the world to be? And to get there over time as quickly as possible, but recognizing it may take generations, because there have been predecessors before us and there'll be generations after us who want to create a world with certain characteristics and values in it. And the chief value, the one that we're talking about here today, is an expectation of all people and places thriving together with no exceptions. Now, to do that, we're going to have to create a system that's designed for well-being and justice. And the people who create that are stewards, who are devoted to equitable processes, combining lived and learned experience, right? Build the power that we need to work together to do things that we haven't been able to do. The means of doing that is a wide sense of belonging and civic muscle. How do we establish opportunities across all of these vital conditions? It's not like we can make great strides toward environmental justice and then neglect kindergarten readiness and reading and intergenerational wealth. There are all these dimensions that matter, and they're deeply interconnected. We shouldn't pretend that they're not. And of course, we should be tracking outcomes. Who is living long, thriving lives and who isn't, and how do we focus on that? That's the way to get more likely effects that are going to be strong and lasting. It doesn't come through, programs and projects that have to be sustained. It comes through particular mindsets and actions, like practices that we could get better and better at doing over time. And this focus, not so much on the products of what we do, but the practices that bring it about. That's something we at our team have had to learn, frankly, from talking with great stewards like Ms. Dora, Ms. Smithers, and really thousands of others have shown us that there are repeated patterns of how people, even if they never use the word stewards, they exhibit certain ways of thinking and acting that turn out to be consistently recognizable. Stewards have purposes that are larger than themselves, right? They want to build power with others and not over each other. And they want to use their wealth and resources to invest in creating things that are better in the future, not to sort of withhold the value that they themselves need. And so unlike a leader who on behalf of an issue or an institution, a lot of us are leading organizations and leading causes, but we can also be better stewards of the systems that we're a part of. And that means these characteristics of connecting across difference, right? Creating opportunities and learning and adapting. Many of the really effective organizational leaders, they don't exhibit these skills necessarily. That's not what gets you promoted in most organizations. But stewards who work in the interspaces between organizations that have always been doing sort of business as usual to ones that are going to make breakthroughs to a much better, more equitable future. These are some of the hallmark characteristics. And we'll put in the chat a sort of backgrounder paper on what these practices are. I'll just spend a moment or so more because it's not like this is just about connection. We've learned how really savvy stewards, they recognize that we all have self-interest. They're just very good at weaving those self-interests together so we can negotiate and how to live together in a common world and recognize that our narrow self-interests are actually bound up together in each other. And we can't do that very well if we're not listening or actively looking for those voices that tend to get unheard. And we're not earning trust in places where it's been broken before. We're not building the shared power to do things that we could never do alone. And of course, we'll never get there if we're going to erode our goals and just hope for a little bit better outcomes within a system that isn't really built for for all of us to thrive. We can, sort of look across timescales. But I heard a moment ago, Ms. Dora spoke eloquently about that idea of looking out over generations, right? To leave a legacy. What is the legacy we inherit? What's the legacy we're going to pass on? These are the kinds of things that stewards care about and they listen for. And of course, we heard many of these practices around looking at the abundance that we've got together. What could we do if we merge two institutions together? And how do we start to get in the habit of not just sort of gathering information, but sharing it back through those newsletters that even somebody in the hospital would read. That's an amazing standard to hold. And I'll say in the last couple of years, one of the things that I love getting in the email every month is the Healthy Communities Shared Stewardship Beacon. This is a curated newsletter that spotlights a vital condition each month, gives profiles of the kind of work that's going on in Delaware, even the kind of data that they're gathering. It is impressive. This September issue talked about a learning journey of folks in Delaware going to visit Philadelphia about what is going on with creative placemaking and how can they take the best of those insights and bring those practices back to their work in Delaware. That kind of desire for action learning, the desire to know that we can get better over time, these are examples of these practices in action And you won't necessarily always see the labels, and it's really important to look beyond the labels to the underlying practice involved here, because not every group is going to be as explicit about stewardship as you've heard from Ms. Dora and Ms. Smithers, as you see from Delaware, Healthy Communities Delaware thing. Most stewards are unseen. And so I'm going to let Verinda take it from here to a group exercise.
Thank you, Bobby. Yeah, like Bobby said, Delaware is doing a really special job of showing how well they're doing as stewards, but as we know, that stewards are often unseen, unrecognized, uncelebrated, but we do see them everywhere. And we are committed to learning and sharing stories of stewards who are practicing stewardship every single day. So today we're going to hear from you and your examples and stories in a quick Jamboard exercise. If you're not familiar with Jamboard, in a second, we'll put in the chat a link to this Jamboard board. And we're going to ask, where have you seen this practice of stewardship in yourself or others? And you can click on the sticky note right here in this red box and put in your thoughts and reflections of this question. We're going to give you some time to reflect, but as you start thinking about your answer, if I were to answer this question, I think back to the young adults and teens I met when I worked at Truth Initiative, the DC-based nonprofit who was working towards a tobacco-free future. Their passion to transform their communities and create a healthy environment free from tobacco and its harm shows me how dedicated the next generation and young adults and teens they're going to drive this change. So that's what I would put, spotlighting the young adults in our country on this sticky. So take about 3 minutes. You can see the link in the chat and put in your sticky answering that question.
Okay, let's take a look at what we're seeing here. I'm just reading them along with you, and if folks have observations about the kind of patterns or examples we're seeing, I'll just say that one of the things that stands out to me immediately is just the sheer variety of organizational context involved here. We've got local policies, we've got school systems, we've got businesses, homeboy industries, and this is one of those characteristics of what I was alluding to earlier, but now we've got like a page of examples about this where if you're looking at the sort of surface of what some change maker is doing around which organizational setting they're in, which topic they're focused on, it'd be really hard to see the through line. But this all came from asking one question, which is, where do you see these characteristics of stewardship in yourself and others? And we could see it manifest across this wide variety of sort of frontiers for actually making the world closer to the place that is built for everyone to thrive. Any other observations? I'm going to turn to my team here and see if anybody else wants to make any other observations about what's on this board.
Bobby, one thing of note that also ties back to something Ms. Dora was speaking about before was in the bottom right there, someone put in about the lawsuit brought by youth in Montana, that they have a constitutional right to be protected by their leaders from the harms of climate change. And that certainly took a Herculean shared stewardship effort. I'd like to point
Yeah,
and
it also illustrates one of those things that you wouldn't necessarily think. One of the sort of first ever landmark sort of legal rulings in America about intergenerational stewardship can come from some of the least expected places, right? This is not a classical organized effort that has been well funded over years. This is in some ways a very focused, passionate effort to bring the values of a state into alignment with their practices. And it was young people mounting that lawsuit that asserted their rights to be in a world that isn't systematically harming them. So all of these things about harm and healing together can become the sort of secret sauce of when we can make great leaps forward in a journey of shared stewardship. So thank you all for for those examples. It's really gratifying to see that even in a quick couple-minute exercise, we can see these sort of characteristics in ourselves and in others. I'll just end by saying that, oops, sorry, let me get back to the screen share here. That a lot of what we're hearing today in the stories from Delaware, in the Post-it notes that you've just put up, these are examples of a characteristic that is not just like newly developed now. It's not a technical skill that any of us need to be necessarily trained in, right? This is a practice that throughout history, human societies would never have evolved if we didn't have some capability of being better stewards of our lives together. And throughout history, we've seen stewards do two things at once. They can extend what is healthy and humane, and they can work with equal vigor to resist and remove what is toxic and cruel. And those advantages and those adversities can change over time. And who knows? We're facing an immense series of adversities now, maybe some that we've never seen before. But that doesn't mean we can't rise to the occasion. And that's really what Stewards Rising is all about. The kind of conversations about multiple generations that we've started here on this call. I've never been in a room talking about stewardship or vital conditions when people don't recognize that, health and well-being, it can go up and down over our lifetime, but we inherit these vital conditions from our predecessors, and we can pass them on for better or for worse for others. And so the conversations end up being about what legacies are we going to leave? How are we going to be good ancestors for generations to come? That's a good question for each of us to ask ourselves and our colleagues in this work, to elevate and get out of that mindset of planning programs and projects and be much more about participating in the kind of legacies that we most want to that we would be proud to leave on to future generations. For today, we're going to end with one quickie poll, and then a little bit of sort of specific resources that are coming next, and then we'll head into a Q&A session. But for the moment, just think about this question and take it seriously. How attractive is the idea of joining with other stewards in a movement to thrive together? And it's cool. If you have doubts about this, there's no doubt whatsoever that this is a risky proposition, right? We're breaking from the status quo, trying to be human in a world that is dehumanizing us. There are real reasons to be cautious about doing this, but looks like some of the answers have slowed down a little bit here. So we'll share this poll of, we are in the company of some pretty undaunted fellow change makers, right? Nearly 85% of us here today. No surprise, right? That you all self-selected to this topic, but now, even after almost an hour of talking it through, this kind of confidence gives me confidence that, all we really have to do is commit to working with each other and stretch ourselves into this kind of infinite practice of deepening our stewardship. So let me turn it over to Maggie to share some thoughts about next steps, and then we'll head into Q&A.
Thanks, Bobby. So that was really good to see. It looks like we're building the movement here together today. It's inspiring to see so many of us drawn to the idea of joining other stewards in a movement to thrive together. Before we move on to the Q&A portion of our time together, we hope you'll take a few minutes to fill out a brief survey on today's webinar. Your feedback is very valuable to us and will help us improve future offerings. In order to diffuse stewardship across the country and beyond, for it to really take hold as a way to drive transformative change, we must share stories of stewardship in action for others to see, learn from, and be inspired by. We've heard a lot of great ones today, and we know there are so many, many more. We invite you to share those stories with us, and we will help get them out through our outlets that are dedicated to sharing stories of stewards, the Unsung Stewards podcast and the Stewards Rising campaign, both of which see and celebrate the diverse efforts of stewards. Reach out to Ripple's Deputy Director of Communications, Layla Hussein, to share your story. And as I mentioned earlier, our next webinar will take place on November 9th, and the topic will be cultivating belonging and civic muscle. Please keep a lookout in your email for the coming save the date. You can register today too, if you'd like, and we hope you'll join us. In addition to the link to today's presentation and recording, you'll find more resources related to shared stewardship, as well as other webinar topics on our website. We'll send you a follow-up email with links to those as well as others. For example, you can dive deeper into the essential stewardship practices and even the first ever nationwide survey measuring shared stewardship. Once again, before we open it up to Q&A, we ask that you provide us with your feedback in our brief evaluation survey. And thank you all. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We are so delighted to see you. We will be staying on the line for another half an hour for open Q&A, so please feel free to hang out with us.
I'm just looking at the chat. For folks that have been reading the chat on our team, maybe we can lift up any questions or observations that are there as well in this Q&A time.
Bobby, I'll ask you a question. One, thanks for doing this. It's always uplifting to hear people in the front lines who, like Dora. One of the things you and I have talked about is what are the structures that support local organizations? In order to be a steward, you got to have a place. You got to be in a place. But it's really hard to be in the front line. So those kids in Montana did not get together and do it themselves. A law firm or a lawyer went looking for them and supported them and gave them. She couldn't have done it without them. They couldn't do it without her. What are the systems of support that you folks have identified, in addition to kind of structuring how you think, which is one way of support? What are the other ones you've thought about?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I'll certainly invite other perspectives from people on this call, because I'm looking at faces of folks who have found ways of doing that in their own work. I'll just reflect on one of the things I've learned about Delaware, and I've seen it in other places too, but it's really indelible. It's sort of conspicuous in Delaware is, they've been carrying on a decades-long, multiple decades-long healthy communities tradition, locating centers of action, pretty close to home, grounded in communities across a small state, but that state is filled with a lot of variation, right? Not everything is like Wilmington, and there are neighborhoods within Wilmington that matter. And so looking at the social sort of landscape of our country and building healthy communities is one thing, but the infrastructure that you're talking about sort of moves to another level when the resources of the state government and the university and the community foundation and others start pooling together to create the infrastructure that is Healthy Communities Delaware, to be able to link those hyper place-based activities into ones that actually ladder up to whole statewide activities. And now suddenly you can learn with counterparts in different places. You can start pooling assets and measuring in new ways. We've got, I see Kate's here on. Kate DuPont Phillips is the exec director of Healthy Communities Delaware, and knows much more than I do about what it took to create that infrastructure. But we shouldn't take it for granted, because it is the unseen way of making this more than just some sort of community change agents on their favorite topic, but building the infrastructure at a statewide level. So Kate, I don't know if you have thoughts about David's question, and certainly others here may also. Yeah, no worries. And I'm looking at other friends here, right? So Keeney Tinkham, who's been building the main resilience building network for, I don't know how many years now. Keeney, have you been up to it? Building that kind of infrastructure so people can take their values and start acting on it. What does that look like for you when sort of thinking about David's question?
Well, thank you. I do think about both empowering self, but empowering others, that shared stewardship, understanding what that is for voice, and recognizing who within community or who across the state is working with different diverse populations, but making sure we're doing it with them, not for them. is what we really work toward. So I hope that answers some of your question. Yeah, so but thank you for calling out the Maine Resilience Building Network.
Yeah, it's so impressive. Do others have thoughts about David's question? I'll just create a little space here if folks have ideas about this. One thing I'll say, David, is we shouldn't overcomplicate it, right? Because nobody can sort of engineer a multi-movement sort of endeavor like this. And so it's really a light infrastructure. So the people who, and the organizations and networks who are doing this work can sort of gain the knowledge and tools and connections that they need to do the work that matters to them. And you never really necessarily know where those are going to come from, but being able to figure out, you know, that there are counterparts in other places, and to be able to share stories about the kinds of circumstances that they've used to set up the experiences that allow people to think and act differently. The goal here is not another program and project in stewardship. It's about how do we create the circumstances that allow people's sort of capabilities for stewardship to shine through. And that means just kind of, you know, it's a different kind of design orientation to how do we set up experiences that are going to stack the deck in favor of people seeing that there's more to this work than just the program or project. I'm seeing some heads nod on that. Ms. Smithers or Ms. Dory, did you have a thought on that? I see your hand up.
How do you keep these individuals engaged? Okay, hi. I was reading this in the chat. How do we keep these individuals involved? I think that once you start a conversation, it does become infectious. And what happens is you can be talking to someone about that something, and maybe that person is not, I don't know, maybe it's not, they don't disagree, but they don't agree. But they usually tell that story to someone else. So the someone else is the person that actually gets involved. Well, they'll say, well, this person told me about this place, and they said this and this and this, and I came because of. And so that's what happens. And it's not, like he said, the lawyer went to look for them. And so what happened, that's how the door knocking started. You go to look to see what is really happening. You can hear what is happening, but did you really hear from the person that said it? So if you didn't hear from the person that said it, maybe it's like, okay, let me go see if they really said this. And so you knock on the door and you say, hey, you know, I'm from such and such a place, just trying to find out how the community feels about where they live. That's one of our questions. Rate your community from 1 to 10. And they did. And we said the next one was, if you had to change anything, what would you change? So they rated it an 8. An 8 is not really a 10. 10 was the highest, but they rated it an 8. So why did you rate it an 8? Because this, and this, and this happens. And so that's how I think it happens. It happens in conversation. You can get in an earnest conversation with someone, even in a grocery store. I was talking to somebody, I had to go to the hospital to get blood work done. I met this young lady, and I said, well, since I've been retired, you know, I said, I'm at a place called NCPC, and I said, we just received this grant, and we're doing this, this, and this, and this. And she called me on the phone. She said, do you remember me, Miss Dora? And I said, well, where did I know you from? And then she told me, you came to the hospital and you had your blood work done, and you was telling me. And she said, you know what? I need some of those services. So you don't know, but you trust that what you're doing is what is going to knit you to somebody else. Yeah. And so the knitting begins when you actually say, well, I've been doing this, or I've been doing that. You know, that the conversation for some reason is because that's where you love. So you're going to talk about where you love, what you love, and who you love. a young guy said to me today, "Oh, it's very obvious that you love people." I said, "Yes, I do." He was like, I think he was like in his 20s or something. And he came in to talk about some of the things that were going on with him and how, we could actually help him. And that's what he said. So it becomes evident that it's who you are, that you are really that love that you talk about. And so even if that person doesn't need it or doesn't see somebody else's, they'll repeat your story anyway. And so then the stories start to repeat and you knit together, just like a knitting club or a crocheting club or whatever, quilting and all those things.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can
go
you hear
ahead.
me?
Yes, we
I
can.
can teach it. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Because I asked the question in regards to the getting communities involved. The only concern with New York City is the gentrification. You have people who are not from that community who are now moving into these communities and are trying to change the norm of that community. And they may have a bigger voice because they are more involved than the actual people who've been living there for 20 to 30 years, who really don't get involved because they just live their life and do their day-to-day thing, and that's it. And then when you have gentrification taking place, it changes the dynamics. It changes what the actual issues that were underlying prior to gentrification. And it's kind of putting a Band-Aid over it or covering the foundation, if that makes sense.
I think we had a similar conversation to what you just shared with colleagues from Asheville, North Carolina, about a year ago now, in a course we did with several place-based philanthropies. And they shared much smaller city, but same issues related to displacement and the challenges around gentrification. And I don't have an answer to the question you're posing, but I think one of the things that is similar to what Ms. Smithers just shared, or Dora just shared, is this notion of people were coming in and beautifying the city and putting up murals. And the reaction was, we were beautiful before. We didn't ask for the mural, and you didn't ask us if we needed the mural. What we need is something completely different. And I think it was such a crystallizing moment for folks we were a very mixed group from very different places who maybe didn't have quite as much of a touchstone to what they were experiencing, that it was this notion, I'm not even going to give it the benefit of well-intentioned intervention, but this notion of people from other places coming in and inserting a perspective and a solution without the knocking on doors that has been so eloquently described for us today. It was really received painfully and caused real harm in the community, not to mention diverted resources to things that maybe could have been more aligned. I think one of the things I'm really reflecting on in all of these examples is just how I want to make sure people leave this hearing us, that shared stewardship is something we have studied. We've articulated some labels and given you some tools and attributes for how people who do this work go about doing it when it is effective. It's not something we're offering to say everybody should go start a stewardship initiative. But we want to offer it in the spirit of saying, those of you who find yourselves doing this work on the front lines, you were doing it before we gave you the language of stewardship. And there's some things you share in common with other people. And we want to make sure you're not alone, because these days are long and hard, and the arc of this work is very long and hard. And so for you to find that you have other fellow stewards who do some of the same things that you are doing, we know can be supportive and energizing for you. I will also say it's a way to articulate a set of strategies and skills that we know you can grow in yourself. And in one of those moments when you find yourself stuck, I hope you'll come back and refer to this list of characteristics and say, I'm like hitting my head against this wall or this barrier, and I keep trying the same thing, and I know that's probably not effective, but I'm at a loss. Maybe it will help you get inspiration for another approach that we've learned from somebody else. Or you can reach out to us, or you can connect to others whose stories we've lifted up. I hope you'll connect with people in this group, because that's why we've studied it, not to say it now can become an initiative or a program, but to suggest that there are some things that you all use in your toolbox. Some of you use some more than others, and some you may have never thought about. But we want to make it visible and give it a name and some structure and some characteristics so that you can reflect for yourself. And as you're working with others who may be new to the work or coming up against challenges, you can help them be even more effective and feel more confident and not alone in doing this work. And I think that the stories you all have shared have been such a beautiful illustration of that. And we are deeply grateful to you for sharing, but also for the work that so many of you do day in and day out. We have the beautiful privilege of being observers and being able to bring people together, but we are very humble about our role in this and acknowledge that you all are very much on the front lines, knocking on doors day in and day out in service of your communities. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to Lindsay's comment in the chat here. It's quite an impressive thing what Washington has done to commit to this idea of sort of co-governance, co-design. Even I didn't know about the recent legislation about being non-extractive. So Lindsay, can you say more about any of that?
I have a question that's a little bit about the gentrification and changing dynamics of places. Is that being a relatively young person, I see that there's a lot of fluctuation that's happening in our world today. And I think everybody is kind of searching for a place of belonging and a place that meets their needs. So how do we does anybody have any insights on how to navigate that of like, who is the community and who owns a place? Because, if I'm a new person moving into a new community, like how do I navigate the fact that I might have needs that are different than the people who are already there? And how do you kind of respect that there are a variety of needs, because we're all different human beings with different life experiences? It's something that I don't feel like I understand very well of like, what is the responsibility for stewardship when you really have blended communities now? You do have communities that have been the same and people who have been in places for multiple generations, but also there's so much more mobility now in this day and age, particularly I think with the ability to now do remote work, that I would imagine there's a lot of young professionals, in my generation who are now thinking, I don't have to live in a city or a metropolitan area to have a good job. Maybe I want to go to a more rural location. And I just see this as kind of a trajectory. And I'm wondering, gentrification, we tend to think about that as being something that happens in urban centers. But Asheville, I think, is a really great example of how, the changing census of people that you have really impacts what those communities look like and what the needs are. That really wasn't much of a question. That was just asking for insights.
Well, I mean, I think it's good that it's not a question, but the issue is that it's not a formula, right? There's not a fixed way to do that. Caring about that question is really the first issue, right? To be not indifferent to the idea that we are very different people, differently situated. Some of us are newcomers to a place. Some of us have been there for generations and have experienced displacement. The issue is to understand and to really make room to talk about our different experiences, what we come to, those legacies that we inherit, and to be able to negotiate a way forward that is honest about what you need, what you're willing to bring. This is not like a vending machine view of society where you pay taxes and the government delivers. This is much more like a barn raising. How do we create together a world that meets people's needs? And that requires being honest and exchange with each other and creating, to David's question, the infrastructure of how do we create venues where it's possible to talk about legacies past and future, to acknowledge that people are differently situated. There's a big ticket word in the field of investment that talks about targeted universalism. It just means how do you invest among those that have the most to gain. But we have to be able to hold universal expectations for everyone to reach their best possible lives, and then be able to acknowledge why so many are so far from that aspiration, because things have been structured that don't really address their well-being or their dignity. And so your question is really a good one for stewards to engage, not as a formula, but as a predicament, right? It's our plurality is sort of part of the human condition, and not many means of sort of creating social change honor that plurality as the central defining feature. So it's one of those kind of, I don't know what to say. It's like, it's a good problem to have, to care about who's where and how do we make a life together.
You had one piece there about being a steward is trying to do a good thing, but also fighting bad things. And I think, which is really important. There's a book that came out in the last year called Poverty by America that makes a really fascinating analysis of who benefits from poverty. Because we saw during the pandemic, we could deal with poverty as a policy choice. We choose to have poor people in this country. We choose for people to work for very low wages. Why? Because a whole bunch of people benefit from it. So I think what we haven't talked about here, and it's fine because we talked about some lovely things here that energize me, which I appreciate a lot, is that there are plenty of people who benefit from the status quo, and they're going to fight like hell to keep it.
I liked the use of the word negotiations too, is that sometimes I think, what powers may already exist might also be actively working against having these conversations. Because if you want to keep a status quo, then you certainly don't want to talk about how things could change. But I think also, I like this idea of shared stewardship and some of the concepts that we were talking about today. And just like, I think that there is sometimes in, how polarized everything's become in our world, that there's a lot of fear and a lot of kind of mistrust to even have negotiations and conversations where you can try and find some common ground. It's much easier just to kind of sink into your comfort zone.
I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is it starts with, I'm going to go back to knocking on doors. None of the stories that we heard today talked about winning people to a position or pushing an agenda. They started with relationships and being curious and open to what the people they were talking to had to share first. And I think that's a really fundamental piece to embrace, and also to really do the self-reflection to say, what assumptions am I holding about a position I want people to come to, versus how open am I capable of keeping myself to letting, if you think of it like the third way, a completely different, unique solution that I'm not even fully aware of yet. How open am I to letting that emerge? And I think that's really hard and it takes time, but that is the starting point that we're offering. And I think the starting point that I would argue communities that have historically been shut out of systems have always, we're not offering anything brand new here. Let's be clear. Generations of communities who have had to take care of themselves because they have been shut out of systems that kept them on the sidelines have learned and know how to do this far better than many of us, myself included. And what we are trying to do is honor and lift up that practice of taking care of each other, because taking care of you and you and you and you makes my day and my life and my experience navigating my community better. So it's that difference between zero sum and I've got something to lose if you have something to gain, and truly embracing the commons and that shared future. But it starts with like, I'm gonna listen, truly curiously listen.
So I'm just going to talk about New York City because we tend to be a hot topic, right? Right now, we are dealing with a crisis, a housing crisis, not only just for our homeless population, but because of particular laws that were stipulated that we are not allowed to refuse any of the asylum seekers who are coming into New York City, right? And then we are now asking, local government is now asking for the same communities to also open their doors into the same and put themselves in the same position of where they already are at a disservice from the government, right? And we're now asking them to, hey, these people look like you, talk like you, and they are more in your vicinity. Can you open your doors to them? And it's where this whole shared leadership or the shared stewardship comes into place, is when it's something that is being kind of thrown to you and you don't have the option to do anything because of the simple fact that now we're dealing with the federal government saying that they don't have any more money to give us for these asylum seekers that they're telling us to take in, that we're mandated to take in federally. But then you're saying you don't have the resources to do that, but then you want city or just local government to now take the budget cuts to actually then make this happen, which then means layoffs, potential raises for people who were supposed to get raises, no longer can get this because we're now taking on this, I don't want to call it a burden, but this new project, right? And it's where do we get this whole shared stewardship of how do we get communities involved when we know that it's not really, I don't want to say it's involving communities, but we are involving communities because it's the same demographics, same ethnicity, same nationalities that are in need of to help these people. And that's where the disconnection sometimes can be for us when we try to say we want to do the shared stewardship, when we're bound, our hands are tied, not only just from the community, but our hands are also tied federally. And it's just that where do local government and try to do this, because we tend to take a lot of the grunt work and having to repair these relationships of communities that already don't trust government to want to now trust government. And then we then throw on this task.
One of the things that we have found is that once again, it redounds to what Dora spoke to, and that is speaking to the people. One of the things that binds us together is a common cause, a common human experience. And so many times people are moved to doing things when they realize that we're all kind of in this together and we have to find the solution together. One of the experiences that we just recently had was a developer was going to come in and put in a storage facility that would provide no jobs for our community, would not be any benefit to our community. And as Dora and her team walked around and talked with people about the impact of this, people turned out, and the developer said, based on the responses that they got from the community, they withdrew the proposal. It's a matter of people not feeling helpless, and I'm sure the situation in New York is somewhat different, and I can't speak to that, but I can speak to the fact that we are in an environmental justice community. There are issues that we all have, and those are the threads that we use to bind us together, to exert strength and energy in a situation that may seem overwhelming and impossible when we look at it as an individual. And this is a time when we're learning that we are a family of people who have common needs, and we have to put aside many of those differences because what binds us together is far greater than what keeps us apart.
Yeah, the thing that this whole exchange is making me think of is one of the skills that stewards do is to shift timescales. Like in any given urgent moment, there can be what seems like an intractable tug of war between two incompatible positions. But as often those grew out of a certain set of circumstances, right? Policy choices that set up that conflict. And to break through the conflict often means looking at the larger time scale, right? Who's benefiting from this? How do we really question whether those are true benefits or not? 50 years ago, Milton Friedman said that the purposes of a corporation was nothing but the narrow corporation. And now it's hard to find a CEO that doesn't recognize that they have commitments to their customers and to their communities and to the legal structures. There are a lot of sort of expanded interests that now go into the calculus of what it means to run a good business. That doesn't mean all companies are living up to it, but the calculus of how to run a business is not just business versus community and how do you maximize profit anymore. That conversation is significantly shifted, so that the options for finding those new ways forward that Becky spoke about become more, right? So the ability to kind of diffuse a tug of war, direct conflict, and to find new ways of developing sort of better solutions than the tug of war is really the way, but it's going to require more time. And that's why this is an intergenerational movement, right? That we're not just looking for shortcuts to well-being for a few. We're looking for durable structural design that makes it impossible for some to thrive and many others to struggle and suffer by design. We're going to meet adversity and we're going to end up with crisis and conflict, but negotiating through those is what the steward looks for. And it's uncomfortable and it's risky. It is not the easiest way to win a following if your goal is to sort of be popular. But if the goal is to have systemic change that's likely to stick, then this is kind of one of the reasons why we're intrigued by what stewards could accomplish.